Good morning, good evening, good anytime around the world. Welcome to our talk series of Ibn Arabi Society, United States. My name is Denise Mater. I am a board member and secretary of the Ibn Arabi Society in USA. I'm very happy to welcome you to our first of the talk series. I will be your host in this session. If you have been in other sessions, you know it is going to be 40 minutes of lecture, then 40 minutes of Q&A. And first half will be recorded. And after that, we'll stop the recording and we'll open up questions. You can ask your questions by raising the blue hand. I think by now we all know Zoom's functions very well. Also that you can write your question in the chat. I have Martin and Lucy, our friends from UK, helping to run this session for us, and we're very excited to get started. I want to turn it over to Maren, our president, to say a few words in introduction, and after that we're just going to turn it over to Dom and Hina to get it started. In the meantime, you'll see that I will mute your lines, and we will allow you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. And so, Maurice?
I hope I don't echo. I'm Maren Gleason, and we're based in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's the Arabic Society in the United States. We have done symposia live. So this is our first time doing a series of talks on Zoom. And I'm so glad so many people have been able to join us from all over the world. This is really a wonderful thing that who would have guessed we'd be able to meet like this. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the talks. And Dom, why don't you go ahead?
All right, thank you, Maren, very much. And welcome everyone to the US Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society seminar series entitled Al-Mizan, Justice and Harmony in the Works of Ibn Arabi and the Akbari Tradition. So the past few years have witnessed an upsurge in the awareness of injustices around the world, from Black Lives Matter protests here in the US to around the world, to Rhodes Must Fall in the UK, to growing awareness and outrage about tragedies afflicting those in Kashmir, Myanmar, Xinjiang, Nigeria, Palestine, and elsewhere, in addition to the broader abuses upsetting the balance of the natural environment. We now seem to be in a time of protests for justice. And in the face of such injustices and calls for justice, we thought we should avail ourselves of the timeless wisdom and insights of Ibn Arabi on justice and harmony. Symbolized in the Quranic term al-mizan, the balance, because the timeless is always timely. So this seminar series will consist of 3 talks. We'll have a wonderful talk today and then over the next 2 Saturdays, followed by a symposium discussion with all 3 speakers. So I will now introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker for today, we're very fortunate to have her, Hina Khalid, who's a first-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. She's working on a fascinating comparative study of the theology and poetry of Muhammad Iqbal and Rabindranath Tagore. She's very interested in the possibilities of comparative theology across Islamic and Indic traditions and the ways that these shared devotional idioms have formed in and across the Indian subcontinent. She's also the winner of the 2019 Young Writer Award for her brilliant and really beautiful essay, A Comparative Exploration of the Motif of Negation as a Process of Spiritual Attunement, with specific reference to the concept of shunyata in Mahayana Buddhism and fana in Sufism. So we're very lucky to hear from her today. I know we'll get a little bit of a taste of her prize-winning essay. So Hina will speak to us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have an open Q&A session, which will be moderated. And I very much look forward to your talk, Hina. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for coming and sharing this space and time with us. Take it away. Bismillah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dom, and thank you, everyone. Gosh, I'm really overwhelmed by the amount of people that are here. I've never done something this sort of big, really. So thank you so much to the Ibn Arabi Society for this opportunity and just for having been so supportive and generous in so many ways over the past few years. This opportunity. I'm really grateful to be opening this series. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. As someone who's only really just beginning to my toes into this vast ocean, I'm sort of really looking forward to kind of exploring these comparative themes together. And I'm sorry if much of this the discussion of Ibn Arabi covers things that people are already familiar with, but maybe by sort of situating them in this comparative way, some sorts of new insights will emerge. So as Dom indicated, most of my talk today will be based on this essay that I wrote, where I explored Ibn Arabi's cosmology and his understanding of the saint or the wali in dialogue with the Mahayana Buddhist notion of the self, or rather the not self, and the bodhisattva, or the enlightenment being, as they are known in that tradition, who realizes and enacts spiritual truth in his or her very person. So that will be the substance of the talk. And I'm sorry if it feels a bit back and forth, but hopefully some sort of coherence will emerge. And as I indicated in the abstract, I will end with a short reflection on an interesting and quite beautiful resonance between Ibn Arabi's explication, the human response to the divine disclosures or unveilings, and a particular episode of the divine human encounter in a Hindu text. So as the leitmotif of our discussion today is harmony, which for the purposes of this discussion, we might consider as a spiritual equilibrium, an ethical in-between, a middle way that is also a kind of all-embracing whole or fullness. I thought I'd set the tone, if I may, with a short reflection by the Indian philosopher-poet Rabindranath Tagore, one of the poets I'm currently working on, who I think many of you will know. Not too dissimilar to the title that Ibn Arabi is often given, the Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest teacher or master. Tagore is frequently remembered as Gurudev, also meaning something like revered master or teacher. Thinking about the etymology of the word harmony from the Greek harmonia, which denotes a kind of fittingness, an appropriacy, or perhaps more literally a concordance. This web of terms is especially crucial to the religious thought and poetry of Tagore, for whom all so-called binaries, the finite and the infinite, the self and the other, the local and the global, are structured by deep-rooted symbioses or relations of harmony, where each requires the other to be fully itself, where it is only in a grand orchestral unity that the individual instruments or notes find their true meaning. Most importantly, for Tagore, God and the world are related like singer and song, the song at each moment bearing sonorous witness to its divine source, and the human being is called to lend its voice to this eternally unfolding symphony. So he says, quote, "This world whose soul seems to be aching for expression in its endless rhythm of lines and colors, and movements, hints and whispers, and all the suggestions of the inexpressible, finds its harmony in the ceaseless longing of the human heart to make the divine manifest." And so for Tagore, we receive God's gift of creation not merely by possessing or having it, but, quote, by producing upon it music, by offering something to God of our own creative abundance and truth, by harmoniously responding to the cosmic call of the divine. In short, the process of human becoming can be understood as a progressive attunement, as we learn to silence our confused noise and chatter and become one with the flowing melody of the world. I draw on these resonances of the term harmony because I think they nicely highlight what will be a central theme of this discussion, namely that the ideas of fana or annihilation in Sufism and sunyata or emptiness in Mahayana Buddhism move away from this conception of knowledge as something definitively obtained or grasped upon completing the spiritual quest. Rather, in both traditions, knowing represents a mode of spiritual wisdom or a dynamic transparency to the way the world is. Adopting the words of Tagore, we might say that the realized in both his worldviews does not possess or cognitively contain truth, but silently sings, witnesses to, even becomes it. So in part one of this talk, we'll discuss the notions of sunyata and fana. And in part two, we'll consider how these modalities are actualized in the life of the individual. We will explore how in Mahayana Buddhism and Sufism, the descent into a nothingness signaled by the terms fana and sunyata paradoxically becomes an ascent towards an integrated wholeness, a harmony. I ground this discussion in these two worldviews, which on the surface seem radically opposed. Mahayana Buddhism, which avoids all kinds of ontological or metaphysical claims in the sense that there is no absolute or God in the way that we conventionally understand these terms. And Sufism, which of course rests on an ontological foundation. However, we will see that Mahayana Buddhism's emptiness is not to be understood as a blank absence or negation, and the divine reality of Sufi thought is not to be understood as a bare presence, something straightforwardly out there, which can be contained by human speech. And this idea that we cannot domesticate or contain the absolute, the divine, will be the key theme of our final exploration of the divine disclosures in part three. So turning first to the Mahayana Buddhist notion of shunyata or emptiness, just a bit of historical background. Mahayana, a Sanskrit term meaning great vehicle, refers to the second dominant tradition within Buddhism, the historically first being Theravada, or the way of the elders. The Mahayana movement arose around the beginning of the Common Era and over time produced several schools of its own. The Mahayana tradition extended earlier teachings of Pali Buddhism with a more elaborate focus on compassion and the holy individuals called the bodhisattvas, in whom this compassion is realized. So the doctrine of emptiness or shunyata came to prominence with what is called the Prajna Paramika, or the perfection of wisdom literature, a collection of manuals and their commentaries that represent some of the earliest texts of Mahayana Buddhism. Of this collection, two texts called the Diamond Sutra and the Heart Sutra are the most well known, and they express the notion of shunyata and its relation to the bodhisattva. Regarding the conceptual background of shunyata, in the historical Buddha's day, the quest for spiritual liberation was understood as the quest for liberating a person's true self, known in certain Hindu worldviews as the Atman, the eternal metaphysical reality underpinning both the individual human self and the external world. The early Buddhist doctrine of anatman, or no self, not self, rejected these positions, arguing that to attribute an enduring metaphysical being to the self in the form of this Atman is to misrepresent the nature of the world, which is in truth a radical flux of becoming. In reality, for these early Buddhist traditions, when we analyze the supposedly unitary I, we find that this is simply a transient collection of 5 mental and physical factors: the body or material form, feelings, perceptions, volitions, and lastly, cognitions. All of these fade just as soon as they arise, and all of them are inseparably connected to each other. According to the crucial Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination, every momentary bundle or aggregate of such factors produces a subsequent bundle. Everything exists and perishes in relation to the existing and perishing of other things. Because these impermanent bundles rapidly succeed one another, we mistakenly characterize them as one enduring and stable self. So the early schools of Buddhism subsequently elaborated this scheme of the bundles or these collections or the various bits that we wrongly coalesce into a single I, into lists of what are called dharmas, meaning foundational elements of reality. These dharmas, although constantly changing and immediately ceasing to exist after coming to be, were understood to be ultimately real because they possessed what is known in these early traditions as svabhava, or self-existence. Each dharma was understood as possessing its own specific nature. For instance, the particular characteristic of fire is heat. It is precisely this idea that the dharmas represent the kind of basic stuff of reality, and that they have their own intrinsic natures, that Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Indian monk, criticizes through his conception of shunyata. Nagarjuna's key treatise on shunyata is called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, root verses on the middle way. The word for middle way here being Madhyamaka, which became the name of the particular Buddhist school centered on his teachings. So Nagarjuna understood the Buddhist teaching of dependent origination, the flux of becoming, to mean this interdependence of everything, which, in other words, meant their emptiness, their shunyata of inherent existence. The early traditions, as we saw, asserted that the dharmas, or the elements that make up reality, are indeed dependent on each other. But this, for Nagarjuna, did not go far enough. The very exercise of isolating and enumerating separate dharmas, each with their own supposed self-existence, is to assert ontological being where there is only, in truth, emptiness. So Nagarjuna elaborates on this principle by drawing out various pairs that exist only as they are mutually conditioned by each other in this dynamic equilibrium. For example, the notions of cause and effect have no meaning independently of their interrelation. Not only does the effect depend on the cause for its existence, but the cause itself can be understood as a cause only in relation to its corresponding effect. So the existence of the child depends upon the parents, but the identity of the parents, qua parents, is also dependent upon the child. Aryadeva, a disciple of Nagarjuna, expounds or develops this theme of emptiness by deconstructing the very idea of a self-subsistent entity. In one treatise, Aryadeva cites the example of someone mistaking a rope for a snake and states, when its specific properties are perceived with certainty, i.e., when we realize it's only a rope, that cognition, that it was a snake, becomes an erroneous one without a real corresponding object. When this false belief passes away, we arrive at a new supposed certainty that the rope is indeed a rope and not a snake. Yet, once this rope too is subjected to the same deconstructive analysis, we discover the parts or the threads that form the rope and the filaments that in turn form the threads, and so on ad infinitum. Thus, Aryadeva says, the knowledge of the rope as a rope is ultimately as false as the knowledge of the rope as a serpent, and the knowledge of the parts of the rope is ultimately as false as the knowledge of the rope. Crucially, the intention here is not to deny our empirical observation of things in the world, where we do indeed see things as particular entities. The discussion here relates to the question of what really exists, i.e. ontology. And for the Madhyamaka tradition, it's precisely because things are empty, i.e. without self-existence, that they exist at all. In other words, it's precisely because the tree has no self-contained or immutable essence, that it is not sufficient unto itself, that it is a tree at all, for it is only what it is in its interactions with the soil and the sun that nourish it. Thus, Nagarjuna affirms, for whom emptiness exists, all things are possible. For whom emptiness does not exist, nothing is possible. If things indeed possessed a svabhava, a self-existence, they would not be the everyday entities that we recognize and know, which exist only in harmonious relationality with other things. Therefore, it is somewhat paradoxically the emptiness of things which secures rather than denies their empirical realities. We might note here that to discuss things as empty is almost to push language to its limit, is not to speak of emptiness already to set up a distinct thing, namely emptiness, which we then ascribe to the world. In other words, in attempting to linguistically express the teaching of shunyata, even if it be only to affirm that all things are empty, one could commit the fallacy of setting up this circumscribed thing or object another rope-like substance that we might then seek to grasp or cling to. David Harvey notes, therefore, that all discussion of emptiness in this tradition is to be, quote, finally given up, as the things which are said to be empty do not ultimately exist, i.e. they do not have self-existence. One cannot say that they are empty. So this, the Madhyamaka notion that the highest truth cannot be conveyed in and through words finds resonance across many spiritual and theological traditions, and is of central importance also in the Sufi path of cultivating proximity to God. The designation of the ultimate reality as ineffable, however, carries different implications across these traditions. On the one hand, for Nagarjuna, the fact that shunyata cannot be fully communicated linguistically or conceptually has to do with the danger of what's called reification, i.e. of converting words into ultimate categories of reality. An example of this reification might be if we were to consider the English phrase, "it is raining." The "it" in this sentence has no referent. There is no substantive thing that is raining. All we mean to say here is there is rain. The "it," in other words, functions simply as a placeholder or grammatical subject, but has no autonomous reality of its own. On the other hand, while in Ibn Arabi's religious worldview, there is an ontological ground of being, namely God, who is permanent and immutable, and is therefore, to use the language of Nagarjuna, characterized by swabhava. The affirmation of ineffability highlights the inexhaustible perfection of the divine, whose ever-changing theophanies elude the grasp of language. Turning now then to our Sufi iteration of nothingness or negation, the goal of the Sufi journey has commonly been formulated as the annihilation, fana, of one's ego self, which is concurrent with the survival or subsistence, baqa, in God. As a lived embodiment of these two possibilities, the narrative of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to heaven came to be understood as the model of the spiritual path. Just as Muhammad's ascension culminates in his direct encounter with the divine, Sufi's own mystical path becomes an active, progressive realization, the haqquk, of the divine unity in and through the multiplicity of manifest forms. Against this backdrop, let us move briefly into Ibn Arabi's cosmology. On the subject of existence, wujud, Ibn Arabi differentiates between the ineffable absolute or real, al-haq, which is the essence beyond predication, and the divine disclosure through the divine names or attributes, designating the diverse modalities of God's relation to creation. These names are said to yearn for concrete existence so that they might display their particular qualities. And in Ibn Arabi's account of creation, God gazes upon the names in their distress and exhales into them the breath of the All-Merciful, Nafas al-Rahman. The names exhibit their own individual properties, and the universe thus exists only through God's unqualified wujud. In this grand cosmic interplay between unity and multiplicity, the divine words display their own distinctive qualities, but in respect of the single breath that animates and supports them, they are identical. Thus, in referring to the cosmos as the shadow of God, Ibn Arabi notes, the shadow is nothing other than he. All we perceive is nothing other than the being of the reality in the essences of contingent beings. With reference to the identity of the reality, it is its being, whereas with reference to the variety of its forms, it is the essences of contingent beings. The cosmos is thus simultaneously he and not he. Insofar as it is differentiated in multiplicity, it has a contingent reality which is other than God. And yet, inasmuch as its existence derives from God at each moment, its reality is ultimately none other than his. As Ibn Arabi affirms, were creation to be disengaged from the real, it would not be. And were it identical to the real, it would not be creation. In this account of the cosmos as the created culmination of God's yearning to become known, Ibn Arabi speaks of the cosmos as a mirror which projects the divine reality into a hierarchy of worldly excellences, determined by the degree to which things differentially reflect the names of God. What underpins the mystic potential for annihilation in God is that the human being resides at the top of this cosmic hierarchy and is capable of manifesting in a microcosm every divine name. The creation of the cosmos is motivated by God's impulse to manifest the divine nature. And to this end, God begins by creating a universe wherein every existent emphasizes one attribute or name of God. The original universe, taken as a whole, was once but an aggregate of discrete properties, and it is not until God also creates Adam that these properties become intensively concentrated in a single reality. The human being is therefore understood as the most perfect self-manifestation of the divine, who encompasses the divine names not only comprehensively, but also consciously. Ibn Arabi therefore refers to the human being as the spirit of the cosmos. The body of the cosmos is lifeless until the human being is breathed into it. This conception of the human being as the refraction of the divine names takes shape in Ibn Arabi's elaboration of the perfect human, al-insan al-kamil. Although the potential to manifest this fullness of the divine names, both quantitatively and qualitatively, lies latent in all human individuals, it is only through the insan that the self-disclosure of God is fully actualized. It is here that the modality of fana becomes significant, and Ibn Arabi uses the image of the polished mirror to illustrate the moment of mystical union, where the densities of the ego self, the nafs, are annihilated from the perfected human heart. Sufi interpretations of such annihilation of the nafs frequently cite the hadith, "My servant continues to draw near to me with supererogatory works so that I shall love him. And when I love my servant, I am the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, the hand with which he grasps," and so on. The divine attributes are not static predicates to be rationally apprehended, for their manifestation involves a moment of union that cannot be contained or finally grasped, but must be continuously, dynamically reenacted. Ibn Arabi highlights the paradox that, quote, "None subsists in the path except him who is annihilated, and none is annihilated except him who subsists. You cannot say I was annihilated from such and such without conceiving of what you were annihilated from." Thus, annihilation means annihilation from a particular, quote, mode of lower consciousness, and simultaneous subsistence through a specific mode of higher consciousness. Notably, Ibn Arabi highlights the ineffability of this highest mode of knowledge. But there is amongst us one who knows and does not utter. His knowledge does not imply an incapacity to know, it implies the inexpressible. It is such a person who realizes the most complete knowledge of God. We are brought back then on a metaphysical horizon quite distinct from Mahayana Buddhism to the notion that ultimate knowledge is to be enacted rather than definitively contained. Turning now to part 2 of the talk, where we'll think about how these modalities of fana and shunyata are concretely embodied in the saint and the bodhisattva. Before getting to the bodhisattva, I wanted briefly to discuss a rather beautiful image which might help us visualize, if that's at all possible, the nature of this emptiness as the principle, the enabler of these vast networks of interrelation that we discussed earlier. One tradition of Mahayana Buddhism, called the flower garland or Huayan school, based its understanding of shunyata or emptiness on an image contained in a text called the Avatamsaka Sutra or the Flower Garland Sutra. In this Sanskrit text, it is said that in the abode of the god Indra, a vast net of jewels extends infinitely in all directions, and in each eye of this cosmic net is situated a jewel which reflects every other jewel in the net. Applying this image to the entire universe, the Huayan school elaborates the idea that everything encapsulates and is simultaneously encapsulated by everything else. The final portion of this text hints towards this vision, stating that for the realized person, quote, in one particle of dust is seen the entire ocean of worlds, recalling, of course, the poet William Blake's famous invitation to see the world in a grain of sand, an eternity in an hour. Developing this sense of cosmic wonder, Francis Cook, the foremost elaborator of this school of Buddhism, asks, in this spiritual imagination, where everything interpenetrates in identity and interdependence, where everything needs everything else, what is there which is not valuable? It is the Bodhisattva, the enlightenment being, who realizes this pulsating truth of the universe and who intertwines wisdom and compassion, Mahakaruna, in a perfectly synthesized unity. This supreme compassion enables the Bodhisattva to live in the empirical world, though without the erroneous ontology that creates negative desires and attachments. The Bodhisattva's role as a compassionate guide begins with the cosmic vow to help all beings, note not simply humans, to freedom in all the states of woe that may be found in any world system whatsoever. Strictly speaking, however, as the Diamond Sutra points out, the Bodhisattva must reflect that although innumerable beings may be led to nirvana, no being at all is ever led to nirvana. Nirvana often understood in Mahayana traditions not as a separate realm or place that one finally arrives at, but as the spiritual state of the realized person. Because of their emptiness, individual beings cannot be said to truly exist, the recipients of the Bodhisattva's benevolence. And it is precisely this aspect of shunyata that impels the Bodhisattva to free all beings from suffering. The Bodhisattva, in other words, sees suffering as suffering, for there are no substantial entities to whom this suffering can be ascribed. This makes the Bodhisattva's compassion truly boundless in scope, in contrast to the compassion of the unenlightened, which often stretches only to those others closely related to the self. As the 8th century Buddhist philosopher Shantideva insisted, when fear and suffering are disliked by me and others equally, what is so special about me that I protect myself and not the other, i.e., all others? Although the ultimate truth of shunyata lies beyond verbalization, the Bodhisattva employs language skillfully and without a crucial aspect of this use of language is what is known as the practice of upaya, or skillful means, through which the Bodhisattva recalibrates, repackages the teaching of shunyata according to the individual needs and understandings of different audiences, just as a doctor prescribes different medicines in relation to the individual diseases of patients. Thus, it is said of the Bodhisattvas, they explain emptiness for the sake of those who are attached to being, and they explain existence for the sake of those who are attached to emptiness. The fact that being is taught to some and emptiness is taught to others not only demonstrates a characteristic middle way position of Madhyamaka philosophy, but also shows that shunyata is not therefore a static or fixed philosophical doctrine to be indifferently imparted without attention to the spiritual state of the listener or student. A real emphasis, in other words, on particularity and individuality. In short, the nothingness of shunyata is to be properly understood as a radical transparency to the world, reflected in the Bodhisattva's compassionate attunement to the suffering and needs of others. This notion of a harmonious integration of vision and virtue is reflected also in Ibn Arabi's understanding of fana, which is complemented by his notion of baqa. In referring to the ascension narrative highlighted earlier, Ibn Arabi prefers to employ the expression nocturnal journey or Isra, both because it is a Quranic term and because it more accurately conveys the completeness of the voyage. Just as Muhammad's night journey involved both an ascent to God and a downward movement or return to creation, Ibn Arabi insists upon the importance of, quote, the concluding phase of the saint's return to a transformed awareness of the physical and social world in its immediate relation with God, and to the particular responsibilities and activities, whether teaching and spiritual guidance or the other tasks flowing from that realization. According to the traditional account of the ascension, when Muhammad is asked by God whether he wishes to stay with God, Muhammad simply responds, Ummati, Ummati, my community, my community. We might see Muhammad's decision to return as in some sense analogous to the vow of the Bodhisattva, who resolves to liberate every being from the suffering of desire and grasping. The saints too, partaking in Muhammad's own downward movement to creation, channel the divine rahmah to the world. And we see instances of this shining sainthood in the wonderful Sufis of Andalusia. In the extinctive mode of fana, the mystic becomes the integrated locus of manifestation for the divine attributes. As the divine names are thus being realized, the ego self passes away, which represents both the divine contemplation of himself in the polished human heart and also the human seeing of itself in its true nature as a microcosm of the divine names. Thus, the baqa in God remains incomplete if the saint does not return to creation, for it is in this world-directed descent that the fullness of the divine attributes is fully and concretely manifested. Ibn Arabi elaborates on this theme by asserting that, quote, if the witness, the shahid, is not found after the annihilation, then it was not truly an annihilation in tawheed, oneness. In virtue of this experience of fana, the saints know that whatever divine qualities or attributes they display cannot be appropriated or domesticated by their individual subjectivity or identity, but must rather be received as the forms of the revealed God. The saint, qua individual, possesses nothing lordly and is only the place or locus of manifestation for the divine. We encounter here then a paradox of this spiritual realization of fana, namely that what does not truly exist cannot logically be said to disappear. What is negated in the moment of fana is paradoxically that which had no autonomous reality in the first place, namely the supposedly distinct individual self. The goal of the circular journey of fana and baqa is therefore the active realization that, quote, our existence from the beginning belonged to God, that we had no existence to start with which could cease to be. Crucially, the lens through which the saints see their true self, through the fana of the ego and the self-disclosure of the absolute, also allows them to see the entire cosmos as the ongoing series of the divine self-disclosures, and thus taste the ontological freshness of each instant. For Ibn Arabi, the cosmos emerges in ever new forms at each moment. Each of these forms comes to be and passes away in momentary succession. The process through which the world is enlivened from moment to moment is itself a continual interplay of fana and baqa on the cosmic level, where the fana of one form gives way to the instantaneous baqa of another. Just as for the flower garland school of Buddhism, the world as a cosmically interdependent network of jewels means that nothing is ever dispensable or inessential. For Ibn Arabi, the world in its pulsating entirety thus becomes an object of wonder. As Reza Shah Kazemi puts it, what the infinite or the hidden treasure loved to be known must be infinitely lovable. Ibn Arabi's vision of the abundant, perpetually transformative nature of the cosmos ultimately centers on the very heart of the saint. Drawing out the etymological connection between qalb, heart, and taqallub, perpetual transformation, Ibn Arabi affirms that the polished heart is the very locus of the constantly changing self-manifestations of God. Thus, Ibn Arabi cites the Hadith Qudsi, "Neither my earth nor my sky are wide enough to contain me, but the heart of my servant, believing, pious, and pure, is wide enough to contain me." This containing of the absolute does not, of course, denote a final circumscription of the divine by the human self, for as we've seen, the infinite self-manifestations of the absolute appearing anew with each breath cannot be grasped in this way. Indeed, Ibn Arabi urges the spiritual aspirant who perceives the inward forms of creation not to stop at any particular revelation. Quote, "If you stay with what is offered, he will escape you." The fullness of the divine self-manifestation in the individual is realized, therefore, to the extent that the individual fulfills their comprehensive function, which is possible only in as much as one does not grasp onto any of the particular modes in which the absolute reveals itself. The saint occupies what Ibn Arabi calls the station of no station, when the manifestations of the divine appear but are never finally held onto. Precisely because the saints are not bound to any particular conception of the absolute, all of the divine names shimmer through them in a balanced and harmonious equilibrium. So I want to end now with this theme of the divine disclosures and equilibrium across Ibn Arabi and a particular Hindu narrative. And in relation to Ibn Arabi, considering more specifically the divine names of Jalal and Jamal. And here I draw on the wonderful Pablo Benito's article on the divine love of beauty. Ibn Arabi defines Jamal, or the divine beauty, as, quote, "the extrinsic attributes of the compassion or rahmah and the grace that arise from the divine presence." And he defines Jalal, or the divine majesty, here the disclosed majesty and not the majesty of the transcendent essence, as, quote, "the extrinsic attributes of the irresistible power which arise from the divine presence." In a somewhat counterintuitive move, Ibn Arabi says that when God discloses himself under the aspect of his majesty, the mysterium tremendum, the fitting response is not, as many Sufi authors thought before him, to recoil in fear or constriction. And conversely, when God reveals himself, his beauty, the appropriate response is not a kind of exuberance or expansion. In fact, Ibn Arabi tells us, it is necessary to face the majesty that comes from him, that from which we might naturally turn away in awe or in fear, with an attitude of intimacy, thanks to which we can maintain a state of balance throughout the contemplation, so that we may be able to understand what we see without being amazed or disconcerted. Just as this disclosure of majesty requires on our part a corresponding closeness so that we don't miss what is being revealed to us, the disclosure of beauty that we might naturally exult or delight in requires from us a measured modesty, lest we think that we have somehow contained or circumscribed the divine. So Ibn Arabi asserts, when the theophany of beauty is revealed to us in the state of contemplation, we should then receive his expansion with reverent fear, since expansion received with expansion leads to a lack of courtesy, and inappropriate behavior in the divine presence is the cause of distancing and isolation. The balance or equilibrium is preserved only where the expansion of the divine is met by our own reverential submission. The divine disclosures demand from us a certain appropriate or fitting response. And so it is that in the Hindu text, the Bhagavata Purana, which celebrates the Hindu deity Krishna as the supreme Lord, we are similarly cautioned against a kind of improper expansion in response to the divine intimacy. Roughly, the story I'm alluding to, shown here on the screen, unfolds as follows. One splendid autumn evening, when the radiant full moon has appeared in the sky, Krishna begins to play on his flute. At these irresistibly enchanting melodies, the local cowherd women leave behind their domestic chores and run to be with him. It is then that the celebrated Rasa Leela, or the dance of divine love that you see depicted here, takes place, as Krishna multiplies himself so that each woman thinks that Krishna is dancing with her alone. They thus become filled with the conceit that they have contained Krishna, that the supreme Lord of the world is somehow exclusively theirs, and at this, Krishna disappears, and the women are plunged into sorrow. Just as for Ibn Arabi, the divine unveilings are intimately real for us, but never finally belong to us, here too, Krishna's lovers had to learn through the departure of their beloved Lord that Krishna was indeed fully theirs, but not theirs alone. In the interest of returning to our point of origin, I will end with a poem by Tagore in which he reworks the scriptural motif, addressing the divine who reveals himself ever new, ever elusively in our finite vessels. You have made me endless, such is thy sport. Emptying me, you have again filled me with new life. On so many hills and on so many river shores, you have roamed, carrying this little flute, playing again and again so many notes. Whom can I ever tell? At your immortal touch, my little heart loses its limits in supreme joy and breaks out in song. Filling only my little fist, you give to me day and night. Countless ages pass and you are not finished. I only continue to seek. Thank you. I just stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Hina, for this lovely speech.
Yes, thank you so much. That's such a rich and beautiful presentation. So now we'll move to the question and answer session of our
Recording stopped.
to continue the conversation. So I would ask you to either raise your hands or put the questions in the chat, whichever you feel more comfortable with. I would like to abuse my prerogative as a moderator of sorts to start off the questions with kind of a two-part, or just two things for you to begin your reflections on, Hina, responses. So one is the role of language and poetry. Here it seems that poetic language in all three of these traditions that you've spoken about seems to be a way to, as one of my colleagues said, F the ineffable. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the importance of poetry in maintaining this balance and harmony between ineffability and expression. And then I also wanted to, and again, feel free to take this or leave this, invite you to connect this to, particularly the last point that you spoke on, to our own experiences of justice or injustice on a social or political level as well. So you can take either of them, both of them, neither of them. Just wanted to give you a chance to respond. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those really interesting and rich questions. Language, poetry, oh gosh, where to start? Well, I think poetry, I mean, already forces us to suspend any kind of assumptions that we have about how language should operate, right? I mean, if you just think of how poetry works as a language form, I mean, all the sort of grammatical forms that you learn in school have to be, you know, they just operate in a different way in poetry. So already from the sort of formal aspects of poetry, you're already forced into that new space where new things are being required of you. And I think particularly because, I mean, you know, when we're looking at poetry across comparative traditions, this theme of like, you know, there is a certain tension that you feel in poetry that there is this constant straining. I often think of poetry as a straining towards something, a sort of elusive thing that cannot be contained, you know, to use this word I've probably overused, and this constant motion. And also that poetry is always a mutual experience. You know, you are always changed in that process. It's not like reading a sort of a textbook where you're just sort of absorbing information and they're there for a particular purpose. I think poetry changes you in ways that you can't foresee. And I think that's the beauty of it. But I mean, there's so much more to be said, but that's my sort of immediate thoughts. Justice, gosh, so much on this, particularly considering the poets I'm currently working on, Muhammad Iqbal and Tagore. I mean, for Tagore, this theme of harmony is really at the center of, as I sort of indicated in the introduction, this harmony that shapes and orders the world, not only on a sort of cosmic ontological level, but really, as you said, on a social level. This idea that the local, that our particular local or sort of national identities can't really, they have no meaning, without this global context. So, yeah, I think it's relevant on so many levels. And I think once we've got this sort of, this sense of harmony as a cosmic principle, that forces us to apply it elsewhere, right? I mean, because we've got this metaphysical harmony that operates, and so we are forced to apply it to our socio-political domains. And yeah, I mean, those are some very scattered thoughts, but yeah, such a rich question. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. So the first hand I saw, again, please, feel free to use the Zoom hand raising function or put a question in the chat. The first hand I saw up was from Sahib Safdar. So I will go ahead and you can unmute and ask a question.
Okay, so can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Hina. Such a lovely talk, very inspiring, the way you've sort of connected the ideas. I've got a very specific question, and I've been really looking forward to your talk this whole week. I've stayed indoors, the sun is out, it's really bright, and it's because of this one question that I've got. It's really about Muhammad Iqbal and his ideas on the self in relationship to, obviously he's a very high exponent of Khudi, which can often get misinterpreted. But in light of what you said in terms of Fana, Baqa, and the Buddhist notions of no self, etc. And but also within that context, I don't think there's enough work done to, although from my understanding, he was actually interested in delivering a lecture at Cambridge on Ibn Arabi, and contacted a saint in India at the time to ask for his advice, because I think he was talking about time and space, but he never got to deliver it. So the relationship, but I think his father was deeply steeped in the Fusus himself, an avid reader who'd held circles on Ibn Arabi. So the relationship with Iqbal and Ibn Arabi in terms of their metaphysical outlook, but starting from this self in respect to what you've just said.
Gosh, well, if I can answer this sufficiently, I would have completed my PhD project. Okay, so Khudi, okay. I think, as you said, Khudi is often misinterpreted, and because Iqbal is such a multi-dimensional thinker, and I think often he speaks about the self in different ways. And so, okay, so first I'll talk a bit about Iqbal and Ibn Arabi. So, as you say, I think Iqbal had this kind of sort of changing relationship really with Ibn Arabi. I mean, his initial comments were quite flattering, and then I think we have to remember his context, right? He was operating in a particular colonial context with a particular agenda, with a particular, in his view, like political, almost prophetic role. But I think we can't really understand his notion of Khudi without also understanding his notion of faqr, or poverty, this ontological poverty, which actually permeates his writings, his poems, and the emphasis on ubudiyya, or cultivating this servanthood. So I think when Khudi is kind of abstracted as this notion of selfhood, without looking at actually what is Iqbal saying about the self and its moments of losing its sense of substance, right? In for instance, when he talks about moments of prayer, when he talks about mystical experience, and the fact that, he elevates the Prophet Muhammad's status as abd, as servant. So I think it's this paradox of the Khudi is always rooted in God, and it only derives its strength from that submission to God. So it's the paradox of an independence and a selfhood that is always oriented and rooted in God. So I think yeah, so which is why, I mean, I often, when sort of this question of Iqbal's relation to Ibn Arabi comes up, I often like to see Iqbal's work very much as suffused with this Akbarian language and cosmology. I mean, you only have to read the first first or second verse of his Masjid-e-Qurtuba, where he talked, this beautiful language of time as the kind of net, or the sort of the thread with which the divine essence weaves its attributes. And thinking about this cosmology, I think it really suffuses his work. But I think the political context that he was in forced him to adopt certain positions. But as I said, this is something I'm working on. So come back to me in 3 years. I might have a better answer. Well, thank you, and thank you for staying in for so long and waiting for this talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'd also recommend there's a new book out entitled Sculpting the Self by Muhammad Farooq that takes up selfhood in Iqbal and Mullah Sadra, as well as a number of thinkers. You might find some interesting things there as well. So we have our next question from Riza Bustami. Please go ahead. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, good. Two comments and questions actually. When you showed the, thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed the similarities of cultures, and also all of us are leading to one source, and all of us are from one source as well. And there's two points which I would like to highlight, and as well as get your further clarification from your good self. One is when you showed the picture of Krishna dancing with the maidens. I remember the similar traditions from the Islamic source, which states that Allah, the God himself, the essence, in relation to the saints, to the Rijal, to the saints, they're like the brides. The saints are like the brides. So all of the men of God, or the persons of God, because some of the saints are also women, they are the equivalent to the brides in the eyes of God. So in that sense, God can dance, quote unquote, dance or with the brides. That's one point. So maybe that will be useful to you, Hina, and whereby you can quote the similarities and the hadith or traditions from the Islamic perspective. The other one is about fana and baqa. Fana and baqa. Again, I myself, I'm a Sufi. I've been practicing Sufi for 45 years already. I'm quite old, you know what I mean? And so being in Sufi order for a very long time, the state of fana is quite easily achieved, in a sense that one can reach that status, or one can reach that maqam or position by doing readings, and by discussion, and by remembering God and all that. But when in the state of baqa, is a state whereby the remembrance of God is constantly mentioned in the heart, mentally. I remember the Sufi saying of Naqshbandi, when he said that the end of all orders, all tariqah is the beginning of my tariqah. Meaning to say that his tariqah is a silent Sufi. And silent Sufi means remembrance of Allah, literally remembrance. Is a literal thing, to remember Allah constantly in heart, without fail, and without it's a constant thing. So the maqam of baqa is a constant state whereby one remembers Allah automatically in one's heart, without even being conscious about it. So that is the status above, which is very difficult to achieve. It will take years or decades to achieve that status. Otherwise, it will be more of an intellectual, like how we discuss now, intellectual pursuits, and we attempt to see God in everything and to remind ourselves, etc., etc. But the final stage, which is baqa, is according to Sufis, is remembrance of God, constant remembrance of God without forgetting Him in the heart, and mentally mentioning His name in the heart. So that's my view. Otherwise, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm not too sure about how the other traditions, the Buddhist tradition about baqa. But fana, yes, it's clear. Getting one with Him, one with the absolute or with the essence. I'm not too sure about the status of baqa in reference to Buddhism or any tradition. But in this case, you are making comparison with Buddhists, right? So let's stick to that. So that's my comment and my suggestions to you. Thank you.
Thank you for those, really interesting suggestions. I love this idea of, the saints as the brides of God and this sort of cosmic dance that's unfolding at each moment. Yes. And on fana and baqa. Yeah, so I guess when I was considering it alongside Buddhism, it's not so much that there are clear kind of overlaps, it's more that this idea of a kind of negation as a paradoxical fullness, right? That this so-called annihilation or nothingness in Buddhism is not this kind of nihilism, right? It's not this, the bodhisattva is enjoined to then live harmoniously in the world as the saint does in Ibn Arabi's vision. And on this idea of fana, of course, fana, there are so many levels and so many different types of fana, right? There is a whole a kind of a sort of list of different types, including the fana of fana, right? What does that, how do we even begin to talk about that? So I think, as you say, it's this constant, that fana is not something you achieve in one moment. It has to be, every moment demands a new type, a new species, a new kind of annihilation and subsequent subsistence. And in doing that, we reflect what's happening in the universe at each moment, right? We enfold in ourselves this cosmic breath that is constantly exhaling and inhaling. So we ourselves become a part of this dance, right? But always remembering who is leading us, that we are never moving with our own footsteps. Anyway, sorry, that just a few thoughts on what you said, but thank you. Those were really nice comments and thoughts.
Thank you. That was brilliant, Hina. And the anniversary usually of saints' death is known as the Urs, is known as the wedding feast, throughout the Muslim world. So the next hand, we have Jibril here who's come to visit us. The next hand I saw up was that of Peggy Schneider. So please, you can go ahead.
Oh, what a beautiful experience you've given us. So thank you so much. I'd like to sort of have you maybe address a little bit more about the mirage and the stories associated with the prophets, because what came to mind is that maybe I was thinking of the prophets, of course, of Muhammad and Jesus. Jesus sort of did a mirror reverse. Our earth is what Muhammad's Baraka rise was about. But I was thinking of also Moses, and he too had an ascent up the mountain, and he came down. But then he also had another journey that contains his teaching and his experience with Khidr. So I would love you to say a little bit more about Khidr, and he's the hidden life force. And what is his role in your imagination? And you mentioned Krishna. So it's all sort of an intertwining substrate, the beautiful Indra net. But could you talk a little bit about Khidr, the hidden life, and maybe Bodhisattva, Did he come down, or did he go up, or is he ever present? And what does that mean?
Gosh, wow, gosh. Oh gosh, that's so rich. So here's our Moses. Oh gosh, I mean, Moses is so fascinating. If I may just share something from Iqbal, he employs this lovely interplay between, so in Persian and Urdu, as many of you will know, the word for breast or heart is Sina. And he links that to the word Sinai in his poetry, and is this beautiful kind of Sina as this unfolding of the Sinai. And of course, if you consider the way that they're written in Arabic, in Persian Arabic. So it's this lovely kind of the heart literally enfolding Moses's vision. And I'm also really interested, now that you mentioned Moses and Khizr and Krishna, in this relationship between vision and voice. And I've always been really quite inspired by the fact that in the Quran, it's so the mountain crumbles, right, when God unveils himself in this theophany that is given to Moses. And it's also said in the Quran that when that if God were to sort of give or place his word, the Quran, upon a mountain, the mountain too would crumble. So the mountain crumbles at the voice and the vision of God. And so thinking about, anyway, that's something about Moses, because I'm very interested in mountains and and Sinai and Sina and this relationship between the heart. And Khizr and Krishna, oh gosh, that's a really interesting connection. I mean, Khizr by definition is this mystery, right? This I mean, if we're talking about things that we can't contain and domesticate, Khizr as questioning Moses in these ways that he's forced to kind of reconceive all the ways that he's understood sin and good things and what's happening in the world. And so Khizr, for instance, in Iqbal's poetry is understood as the sort of initiator into poetic mysteries. But now you've forced me to rethink and question. So I'm sorry that I can't offer you any more than that, but just lots to think about. Wow, Khizr and Krishna. Khizr and Krishna, that's a nice alliteration. Thank you.
Thank you. That's
Thank you,
very rich.
Peggy. Thank you.
No, thank you. That was really great. I got the image as you were speaking of God comes down to dance with Musa in the form of Khidr, and then just when he thinks he can't take it anymore, he starts asking those questions. Then he disappears. And he goes away, just like the gopis in the Krishna story.
Yeah.
So the next question, the next hand I saw was from Bharatwaj Iyer. Please go ahead.
Hina, thank you very much for that profound presentation. I was struck by two things. One was poetry, and in the end of the presentation, you hint at the adab in devotional practice, and especially with the reference to Krishna. I was reminded really of South Indian bhakti tradition. I'm a South Indian. My mother tongue is Tamil, and in Tamil bhakti, there is poetry, and poetry is very powerful. And poetry is the foundation of canon. The Vaishnava canon in the South is founded on poetry, and it's in Tamil. It's called Agappurul, which is sort of erotic, but not really erotic poetry. And when the poet addresses Krishna or God, there are questions that arise about adab, really. I mean, you can, so poetry is very powerful. You can use it for connection with God, but you can also misuse it or abuse it. So your poetry has to have that harmony. And the Vaishnavite teachers, the acharyas of the tradition, they are always concerned about the limits of this. I mean, how much can we speak, how much we should not speak. So in a sense, poetry does speak about these deep issues, about harmony, about justice, and it can spill over beyond poetry, beyond just the artistic form of poetry. And the Vaishnavite tradition, especially in its poetic form, represents that. And which to me, it's really not a question, but which to me points to the power of poetry in the question of justice and harmony and so on. Although it's seemingly a very soft thing, it's really very powerful. And in historically also, it has been that. So yeah, so thank you for the presentation. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting, because now I'm just thinking about how poetry flows through the body in a way. You know, when you read poetry, and it's an embodied experience. I mean, it's never just a sort of passive mental absorption. It's a kind of constant, it demands everything from our bodies, as you say, just as worship does, just as prayer does. So, and thinking about kind of poetry as prayer is something I'm really interested in. And yeah, and thinking about, as you say, these forms of worship that are, or ritual, particularly in the Vaishnava tradition, and how the devotee cultivates this stance almost towards Krishna. You know, do you relate to Krishna as your lover, as your child, as your as your, you know, all the manifold relations that he exists in with respect to his lovers, his manifold lovers. So yeah, so the fact that even that poetic form can take on a different hue or character in relation to how one looks at Krishna. So like, for instance, if you look upon Krishna as your baby, you could sing him a lullaby or something, you know. that poetic form can be so different. Anyway, thank you for those comments. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, I remember Robert Pinsky, the former U.S. poet laureate, said that the poet's canvas, or what the poet works with, is not just words; it's our bodies and breath. The composition, what the poet works on, the canvas of the poet, is our very bodies and our breath. And that's very powerful, very, very clear in these South Asian and Islamic and South Asian Islamic traditions as well. Very, very clear on that. All right, so we have another question from Riza Bustami.
Oh, I think he's muted.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, it's not a question actually. It's just my the remarks about Krishna, the relationship between Krishna and Moses, and we look at the history of Krishna. There's similarity between Krishna and Moses. Moses, when he was a baby, the Pharaoh wanted to kill him, kill all babies. So the mother, Moses' mother, set him off in a river in the Nile, and that's it. You know what I mean? And then later on encountered him, and the same thing. The same history is also for Krishna, because during that time there was the king. Then I can't remember the name of the king. I wanted to kill all babies, and the same thing happens also to Krishna. Krishna's mother, left in a basket and in the river. I can't remember the name of the river as well. So that is a similarity there. To me, since we are talking about Hinduism and the reincarnation and all that, I strongly believe that Krishna and Moses are the same soul. As to the aspect, because there's a similarity there.
Yeah.
Similarly as well, if you look at talking about Buddhism here, the closest parallel to Islam is Ibrahim Adham, where Gautama Buddha himself, he was the prince, and he left all of the luxuries from being a prince, from being a king, and he left everything to seek spirituality. The same thing with Ibrahim Adham from the Islamic spiritual side. He left everything to seek God. And Ibrahim and Gautama Buddha is close to that, in my opinion. So if you talk about in terms of reincarnation, It's the same soul. It's the same plight. And coming back to the question was asked just now about the relationship about Khidir alayhi salam, the mysterious mystic in from a Hindu concept. The closest will be Vignaharta Ganesha. He is very close to. He is the mystic, and nobody can unravel, can understand him. So he's that. Whereas Moses is grounded in Sharia, in the laws, and Khidir, he is grounded in the other realm, whereby he can kill anyone. He knows the knowledge directly from God, and he can execute anything that he wanted without following the Sharia. Similarly, also with Vignaharta Ganesh, he is the son of both Shiva and Parvati, and he's supernatural. He is the life. Just like Khidir is the life, Ganesh is also the life, and Khidir is also the life. The same thing also, what I call Isawiya, or the maqam of Isawiya, which means that the station of Isawi, of Isa, which is Jesus. So all these are parallelisms, or are the archetypes of Ganesh, Khidir, and Isa, all the same archetypes, which is Isawiya, whereby they've got the spiritual strength to imbue life in people and imbue special knowledge. And this is my opinion, and this is my opinion, my comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Riza. We have another question from Susan. You can unmute yourself.
I'm trying here.
There we go.
Thank you very much for a very extraordinary kind of cross-pollination of, somehow we all know we have a singleness of heart. But as you point out in the flower garland, it kind of fragments into every individual heart being a different manifestation of the beings. My question comes into perhaps using the terms, because there were so many ways you were cross-pollinating, whether referencing bodhisattvas and walis is in essence appropriate to the two systems. My understanding of bodhisattva is that once you have achieved a level of Buddhahood, one then takes the vow to, if you will, relinquish your Buddhahood to fulfill a very different role in continuing through skillful means to help all sentient beings achieve a place of non-suffering, that all sentient beings have the right to happiness. No sentient being should suffer. And as you point out, suffering then becomes not personal for the bodhisattva, but it is still personal for those who have not arrived at that state. However, it is not done through God, which takes the role of the wali into a very different, as I understand it, because I have only started to study Islam as kind of my plague project this last year, realizing that as an American, I knew nothing about it. And it seemed like a worthwhile way to dedicate my time. But that's a very different role that God chooses you out for. And while you can get slippery about it and all slide back into one heart, one mind, and it's all a great dance under a full moon, the reality is that there are two very different metaphysical systems here. I one time had the opportunity of hearing His Holiness in a press conference when asked the question of do Buddhists believe in God, answered it by saying, we're still studying the mind, we haven't gotten to that question yet, which I thought was a very interesting way of looking at it. So I'm just curious to know how you approached those two functions. And I wasn't quite sure I heard a full connective. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's an important point. I think one always runs into the risk when doing comparative stuff that one is conflating. Yeah. So no, that's an important point. And my intention definitely wasn't to suggest that these two figures occupy the same kinds of positions or in some sense neatly map onto each other. I think the point of comparative stuff like this is more to think about the possibilities that emerge when reading these independent traditions alongside one another. So I think in terms of the sort of the overlap of the function, if we want to call it that, I think the way I would understand it is this really through the prism that has framed this conference of harmony, and the fact that harmony is instantiated in the figure of the saint and the bodhisattva respectively, that this sort of integration of one's spiritual vision and ethical virtue becomes sort of focalized in these two figures, despite, or perhaps, and the sort of difference of the metaphysical underpinnings, which I try to acknowledge at the beginning, I think doesn't necessarily preclude us from drawing these sort of comparisons and insights. But provided one does so carefully and with caution. So I think that's where I would really understand the sort of kind of meeting point, the intersection. Sorry, I think you're muted, Susan.
So one could then posit that looking at from within their cultural environments, they're perceived in comparable ways, that one would lay to them modes of behavior, even though they're having arrived at that point of action within their metaphysical systems, are coming from entirely different points. Could you say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I need to flesh this out more properly, so I don't want to give a sort of immediate response, but yeah, I think something like sort of, again, this is the difficulty with comparative stuff, that it's not about saying that, okay, the bodhisattva and the wali are in some sense, that they sort of neatly overlap or map onto each other. I think, as you say, from within their respective traditions, and again, even within their traditions, the understanding of the wali will vary. So of course, we have to acknowledge all of that nuance as well. But I think for the purposes of this discussion, it was more about thinking, okay, what does it mean for knowledge itself to become embodied and to become enacted in this way through these very different traditions, through these very different figures, with their own nuances within their own traditions as well. So yeah, but I definitely have to give more thought to that. So thank you for that.
Thanks for that important question, Susan and Hina. And also, since I'd also want to emphasize, as Hina said, Islam is not, and Buddhism neither, they don't have a similar, a single metaphysical framework. Within the Islamic tradition, you have dozens of very different metaphysical frameworks. And God, what it means for God to choose someone as a wali, even in different places in Ibn Arabi's text, looks very, very different. And in the conception of God, or al-haq, in many places as the inscrutable essence is described in language that, if you translate it from Arabic into English and then translate it from Nagarjuna Sanskrit into English, sounds very, very similar in some places. And then in other places sounds very, very different. So even within just Ibn Arabi's own writings, you have many, many different metaphysical frameworks. And then within the Buddhist tradition, even within the Madhyamaka tradition, you have many, many different metaphysical or anti-metaphysical frameworks. But what I think, for me, what really was striking that emerges when we look at the figure of the Bodhisattva, for me, Ibn Arabi's notion of insan al-kamil, those human beings through whom mercy is had on the world, through whom compassion suffuses and mercy suffuses all of existence indiscriminately. That it really brings out and emphasizes that aspect of the Akbari tradition. And then looking at the Akbari tradition also brings out and emphasizes the kind of spiritual ascent and return that's there in the Madhyamaka tradition. That otherwise, if you're just reading it on its own, might not be as apparent. So there's a kind of magic that happens. It also happens when you're doing translation and going back and forth between these two systems that I think can be mutually illuminating without reducing them to a kind of least common denominator thing. So thank you, Hina. Thank you for that important question as well, Susan. So we have a question from Mick. If you could unmute yourself, Mick, MIK.
Yeah,
there we go.
thanks. Thank you. So Hina, this is really exciting research that you're doing. I live in Bangladesh, so just looking at these traditions which kind of coexist side by side in Bangladesh and of course in traditional Bengal, I just wonder, I mean, how do you kind of envision this important research kind of being shared for the benefit of the kind of the common public, because it's so essential that these teachings, you know, in a highly kind of communalized environment are kind of brought in to help us understand each other in a much, you know, in a much deeper way. How do you kind of see that process and avoiding it from just remaining a kind of academic exercise, if that makes sense?
Thank you. That's, oh gosh, actually something if I'm honest, I haven't given much thought to be honest, mainly because I've been thinking of just getting the work done. I can't sort of see it yet as a finished thing that I then sort of take out there. I still feel very much it's all still a work in progress. So I haven't given that much thought, but no, that's an important element. And I think I'm quite interested in sort of the possibilities of interfaith stuff happening within the UK. And I'm also interested in sort of cross wisdom traditions, particularly thinking about the feminine across different traditions. So I'm sort of part of this Friends of Sophia group, which is a kind of exploring feminine wisdom and tradition across different faiths. So so thinking about figures like the goddess in Hinduism and the divine feminine. So these are all ways that I see a kind of possible public, what do they call it now? Outreach or something. But honestly, it's not something I've really given much thought to, mainly because I don't see myself as ready yet. But thank you. That's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yes, yeah, how do we translate these teachings of harmony and justice into harmonious and just interactions amongst ourselves? I mean, traditionally in South Asia, like so many other parts of the world, it's poetry. I mean, how do people learn etymology?
Exactly.
Metaphysics and schema and all these teachings, it's through poetry. And whether it's Yunus Emre's stuff in Turkish, or in West Africa, we have Ibrahim Yasser's poetry, or Hamza Fansuri in Malaysia, or Hafez, or all of these wonderful, beautiful poetic traditions, or the Baul tradition in Bangladesh. You get these very, very, very deep, profound, rich, and complex traditions that become children's songs. And
oh my gosh, children's songs. This is such an important element which should not be forgotten, because I mean, both Tagore and Iqbal wrote poetry for children in such beautiful ways, and I think often this is the best way to articulate these ideas. And on poetry as well, one thing that came to me as you were talking was the fact that often, like, so now, you know, when I think about Krishna and sort of my own personal relationship and sort of love for Krishna has really grown through reading what other people have said about Krishna. You know, this strange way that love becomes transmitted through other people's love, right? Like you end up loving figures and knowing them more through the fact that other people have loved them so much. Anyway, that's just a comment.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to ask. Yes, I see a hand from Marianne.
Hello. I really enjoyed your talk, Hina. It was lovely, inspiring. And you said something about Insan al-Kamil. And I was reminded of something my sheikh had said, that we should try to manifest the divine names within us. And so I don't know if that would help with harmony, but it seems to me that if we can become more aware of ourselves and the divine names that we've been born with, and I really found this very helpful. He said the divine names we're born with are those that are easy for us to do, like being generous or being of service, being compassionate, forgiving, these things, which are the Jamal attributes of God. But he also said that the things that are hard for us to do, those are the ones that we should work on. So if it's hard to be forgiving, or if it's hard to be generous, or whatever else, you feel you need to work on, and we all have that. I think that helps bring peace and harmony to the world, because whatever you do, it's like a wave. There's repercussion elsewhere. So when you help someone, give someone a smile, anything that can make somebody's day, a compliment or whatever, who may be going through a hard time. And then I think that helps with the harmony that the previous fellow was asking about. But I thought your talk was wonderful, and it made me realize that there's a lot that we don't know, but there's also a lot that we are inspired to know in our quiet moments. We're given those things. And I think poetry is a beautiful vehicle to share the emotions and for people to respond that way, more so than in, I guess, a normal nonfiction book.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm just reminded of, I can't remember the source of this, but somewhere someone wrote that saints are poetry in motion. And this, as you say, this dynamism, this sort of harmony of the attributes and manifesting those within us, and that it's often so difficult, but at the same time something that once we're there, once we've sort of so-called attained it, but the point is you never fully attain it. That it's a constant, this constant sense of being demanded and called to something. Which is why I quite like this, thinking about these ideas in terms of the call and response, this idea that we're always called to something and the response can always be different in some sense. And that the response always has to correspond. It's not just a response, it has to be fitting and appropriate, which is why I really like this idea of the divine disclosures and responding appropriately. So yeah, thank you for those thoughts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Hina, for your wonderful presentation and staying with us so long to share your reflections and thoughts. And thank you all of you for joining us and for your wonderful questions and thoughts.